I knew something was off the moment I saw the smoke curling above the fence line. I dropped the wrench I was using to tighten a bolt on my motorcycle and bolted for the backyard. My custom-built, cedar-paneled, tool-packed retreat was up in flames. The heat hit me before I even reached the gate. I yanked the hose off the wall and turned the nozzle. Water spit out weakly. The pressure was garbage, just like everything else in this HOA-run neighborhood. No time to complain. I sprayed what I could, but the fire laughed at my efforts. By the time the firefighters showed up, the shed was a charred skeleton. An arson investigator stood with me afterward, kicking through the blackened debris. "Accelerant," he said, pointing to the corner where I kept my gas cans safely sealed. "By the way," I nodded. "So someone lit this on purpose?" He looked at me grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. I didn't have to think hard about suspects. Only one person in this neighborhood had a vendetta deep enough to torch a man's shed over a couple of $100. Lorraine Barkley, head of our HOA, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac and the absolute worst kind of middle-aged tyrant. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a voice like a blender full of nails. If your grass was 2 inches too tall, she'd slap you with a fine. If your trash bins were out 10 minutes too early, she'd take pictures and email the board. And 2 weeks ago, she handed me a letter at my front door. "You're behind on your HOA dues, Mr. Owen Walters," she said, holding the envelope like it was toxic. "You have 10 days to pay or there will be consequences." I'd laughed. "Lorraine, I paid. I have the receipt. Maybe check the books before threatening people." But she didn't care. "If you don't comply, you'll be in violation. And violations escalate." Guess she wasn't kidding. I called the police, filed a report. But they needed proof, and of course, Lorraine had covered her tracks. Well, no witnesses, no cameras. What she didn't know was that I had an ace up my sleeve. 2, actually. The first was my neighbor, Old Man Rudy, who just installed a 4K security cam to watch his rare orchids. Thing had a full view of my backyard. The second? I used to work in insurance. Fire claims, to be exact. I knew exactly how to handle this. That night, I knocked on Rudy's door. "Owen, you see that fire?" "Awful shame. I need your camera footage, Rudy. Please tell me it caught something." He nodded. "Oh, it caught everything, all right." We pulled it up on his tablet right there in his living room. And sure enough, at 2:43 in the morning, a figure snuck around the side of my house. Lit a rag, tossed it through my shed's side vent, and ran. Clear as day. Even clearer? The pink jogging suit. Custom embroidery on the back. "Barkley HOA board president?" I read aloud. "You have got to be kidding me." Rudy blinked. She really wore that to commit arson? She's not even trying to hide anymore. I had what I needed. I downloaded the footage, called the detective handling my case, and emailed it in. But I wasn't stopping there. Lorraine thought fines and threats made her untouchable. That was her mistake. She didn't realize she just committed arson, destruction of private property, and attempted insurance fraud if she tried to frame it as an accident. She also didn't realize I'd already filed a civil claim for damages itemized, with documentation. And since I knew the system inside and out, I'd made sure every expense was accounted for. The claim was for $78,000. And I wasn't bluffing. The next morning, I walked into the HOA meeting with a printed folder, a calm smile, and a copy of Rudy's footage. Lorraine was sitting at the head of the table, sipping from a mug that said, HOA Queen. She glanced up and narrowed her eyes. "You're not on the agenda, Mr. Walters." "Yeah," I said, sliding the folder across the table, "but I think you'll want to make time for this." Lorraine didn't even glance at the folder. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms like she was settling in for a lecture she'd already decided to ignore. "If this is about your shed, take it up with your insurance. This is a board meeting, not a therapy session." I didn't sit down. I placed a second copy of the folder in front of Richard Peterson, the treasurer. He was the only board member who didn't seem fully under Lorraine's thumb, more accountant than enforcer. He flipped it open, and his eyebrows climbed the moment he saw the time-stamped stills. "You should probably see this," he muttered, nudging it toward the rest of the table. Lorraine didn't budge. We don't entertain baseless accusations. Then you'll love the part where I handed this evidence to the police. They didn't think it was baseless. That got her attention. She stiffened, but her face didn't flinch. You're bluffing. Detective Boylan doesn't bluff. He's already requested a warrant for access to HOA financials, by the way. I'm guessing they'll want to know why the same board president who levied a false debt also showed up on camera in the middle of the night with a lit rag and a gas trail. The room fell silent. Even the ever-loyal Dale, who usually backed Lorraine like a bodyguard, looked uneasy. He adjusted his collar and avoided her gaze. Richard cleared his throat. You said a warrant's been filed? That's right. And you're all named in the investigation as potential witnesses unless you want to be considered complicit. Your choice. Lorraine's voice was razor-thin. You don't know what you're talking about. This is a personal attack against me. Personal would have been me going to the press first. Or the mayor's office. But I figured I'd give you the courtesy of seeing how far you wanted to dig your own hole. She stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the tiled floor. This meeting is over. Not yet. I also filed a civil suit this morning against the HOA and you personally, for damages, trespassing, and emotional distress. That includes court fees, itemized loss, and punitive costs for malicious intent. You can't sue the HOA, she scoffed. I can when it's being used as a front to target residents through fraudulent claims and retaliation. And let's not forget arson isn't just a civil matter, Lorraine. That's prison time. Her jaw tensed. Not a word. Richard pushed the folder toward her. You should seriously consider stepping down. She spun on him. You're taking his side? I'm taking the side of not ending up in court. She turned to Dale, then to Yvonne, the secretary, clearly expecting support. But both sat frozen, their eyes downcast. She was alone, and she knew it. I left before she could come up with another excuse. I had other priorities now, like securing my property and meeting with the detective again. The footage had opened more than one door. Turns out Rudy's camera had caught more than the fire. It had picked up Lorraine letting herself into my backyard the night before, standing near my breaker box, cell phone in hand. A second visit. That detail had caught Boylan's attention. Looks like she was checking your electrical setup, he said, flipping through the stills during our second meeting. That's why the fire suppression delay makes sense. She tampered with the circuit. That's premeditated. What does that change? It means we're not just looking at arson. We're looking at attempted insurance fraud, property sabotage, and possibly attempted injury. If you'd been in that shed. I wasn't, but I get it. We're going to move this case to the DA. Once we verify the source of the accelerant matches what's in her garage, she'll be facing real time. By the following week, Lorraine's car was gone from her driveway. Word was, she'd hired an attorney and was preparing to retire from her position for health reasons. No one bought it. Within days, the board held an emergency vote. Richard stepped in as interim president. The first thing he did? Suspend all pending fines, release a public audit of HOA books, and schedule an open forum with residents. I showed up early. This time, not to argue, but to listen. The room was packed. People I'd never seen before came out of the woodwork, nurses, retired teachers, a paramedic, even a guy who ran a mobile mechanic business out of his garage. Everyone had a story. She fined me for a hose left on my lawn overnight. She threatened to tow my niece's car for parking too close to the curb during a birthday party. She gave me a violation because my mailbox paint was fading. Turns out, Lorraine had been ruling with scare tactics and empty threats for years. But no one had challenged her until she got bold enough to commit a felony. Richard stood at the front of the room, holding the mic like a man who hadn't planned to be a leader but realized someone had to be. We allowed a culture of fear to take root, he said. That ends today. Applause broke out. Genuine. Not the polite kind. When the mic passed to me, I kept it brief. I didn't plan to make enemies when I moved here. I just wanted a quiet place to work on my bike and mind my business. But when someone crosses a line this big, it's not about dues or fences or grass height anymore. It's about whether we let fear run our neighborhoods. Afterward, a few folks came up to shake my hand. One of them was a woman named Clara, who'd lived 3 houses down since the 90s. I used to be on the board. She pushed me out. Said I was too soft. You're the opposite of soft if you lasted on the board with her, I said. She laughed. You planning to stick around? I was thinking about it. Good. We need someone who knows how to stand ground. Lorraine's house went on the market 2 weeks later. Rumor was, she tried to sell it quietly through a private listing, but the arrest warrant made that tricky. She was picked up just outside of town, her lawyer driving the car. No press release, no HOA memo. Just gone. The shed? I rebuilt it better than before. Reinforced frame, dual locking doors, proper electrical. Rudy helped me finish the roof. Said it was nice doing something that didn't involve orchids for a change. The insurance claim was approved in full. My civil suit? Still pending, but my attorney said the evidence spoke volumes. He was confident Lorraine would settle before it ever reached trial. Not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't afford not to. One evening, as I locked up the new shed, Clara walked by with her dog. She paused at the gate. You ever think about joining the board? She asked. I shook my head. I prefer staying off committees with agendas. You've already done more for this place than any of them did in 5 years. Maybe, but I'd rather keep fixing engines and catching arsonists on my off time. As she walked off, I watched the sun dip behind the houses. The neighborhood felt quieter now. Not because it was silent, but because the tension was gone. People didn't glance over their shoulders anymore. No more measuring lawn height with rulers or peering through blinds in paranoia. Lorraine thought fear would keep everyone in line. But all it took was one camera, one fire, and one stubborn resident to kick over her little empire. She built her power on threats. I dismantled it with proof. 2 weeks after Lorraine was arrested, a county prosecutor showed up at my door. She was sharp dark blazer, hair tied back, no wasted words. Introduced herself as ADA Marissa Keller. Assigned to the case after the DA's office reviewed the video and the HOA's internal audit. I invited her into the kitchen, still half covered in blueprints from the shed rebuild. We've already got enough for arson, she said, flipping open a tablet showing a log of flagged HOA transactions. But this goes deeper. We believe she siphoned funds from the HOA's emergency maintenance account into a personal escrow. I leaned back against the counter, arms folded. She was skimming? Looks like she started around the same time she began issuing excessive fines. That money should have gone toward community repairs. Instead, it paid for a kitchen remodel in Naples and travel for some board training conference that doesn't exist. I watched her scroll through itemized expenses, airfare receipts, a contractor invoice for a Florida property, even a spa package filed under legal consultation. Any of the other board members tied in? Keller paused. We think she signed the checks herself. The rest may have been unaware, but were freezing accounts and issuing subpoenas to be sure. HOA boards aren't above the law, especially when they operate like miniature regimes. I nodded slowly. She was always careful to pin everything on the board when residents pushed back. But no one ever saw meeting minutes, no one ever voted on anything. She ran it like a private business. Well, now she's going to have to answer for it like one. We're preparing to charge her with felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and tampering with municipal records. The arson charge will be separate. If convicted, she's looking at 15 to 20. I exhaled. She nearly burned down a house over a fake debt. That wasn't just petty. That was calculated. She picked the wrong neighborhood to treat like her fiefdom, Keller said, and the wrong man to try to intimidate. She left with copies of the statements I'd collected and a list of residents who'd told me they were willing to go on record. I spent the rest of the day knocking on doors, gathering affidavits from neighbors who'd received strange fines, threats of lien placement, or unexplained HOA fee hikes. That weekend, the county held a public hearing at the Civic Center. The place filled with more than 100 residents from every corner of the district, people from other neighborhoods who dealt with similar HOA abuses, some of whom recognized Lorraine from regional board meetings. A quiet man in his 60s stepped to the mic during public comment and said she'd once tried to have his car declared abandoned because he didn't drive it on Sundays. Another woman described how her autistic son had been harassed for leaving his bike on the porch overnight. Lorraine had labeled it visual clutter. When my turn came, I didn't mention the shed at all. Instead, I asked the county to consider mandatory financial transparency laws for HOA's monthly spending reports, open votes, and external audits for any HOA receiving more than a certain amount in residential dues. The crowd applauded. The council took notes. And by the end of the meeting, the room didn't feel like a collection of scared homeowners anymore. It felt like the start of a watchdog movement. I didn't go home right away. I grabbed dinner with Rudy and Clara at a diner near the freeway. Clara brought a manila envelope, copies of old board rosters, and an email thread from 3 years ago where Lorraine pressured the board into removing 2 members who'd questioned her handling of landscaping funds. She always said they stepped down voluntarily, Clara said, sliding a photo across the table. But I found this in the archives. Look at the timestamp, same day she called an emergency session without notifying the rest of the board. I examined the email. Clara had annotated it with highlighter and sticky notes. Rudy leaned in. She got rid of anyone who asked questions, he said. That's how she kept control. I took the folder. This needs to go to Keller. By the time I drove home, the street looked different. A teenager was out skating in the cul-de-sac without a parent hovering nervously nearby. Someone had set up a lemonade stand near the corner, which Lorraine would have fined into oblivion. It felt like the neighborhood was exhaling for the first time in years. The next morning, I got a call from Keller. They'd executed a search warrant on Lorraine's properties and found multiple HOA documents stored off-site, some dating back nearly a decade. She kept handwritten notes on residents, Keller said, voice low but charged, including a list of who she considered compliant and problematic. You were marked as non-cooperative. Watch closely. I laughed once. That sounds about right. She also kept copies of anonymous complaints. Most of them were fabricated. We cross-referenced them with timestamps. Several were submitted when she was out of state. Others were written in her handwriting. Let me guess. She used those to justify fines. Exactly. It was a paper trail built to look like community concern, but it was all her. She manufactured justification for everything. What happens now? We're expanding the charges. The fraud alone now exceeds $200,000 across 3 subdivisions. She's going to be arraigned on 17 counts. I hung up and stared out the window. Birds were picking at the grass near the rebuilt shed. The quiet had returned, but this time it felt earned. A week later, Richard called a special HOA meeting in the community park. No chairs, no podium, just neighbors standing in a loose circle under the shade of the sycamores. We're rebuilding this thing from scratch, he said. No more closed-door decisions. No fines without board approval and documentation. And anyone who wants to run for a position? You're welcome to. We're not holding on to power, we're sharing it. Clara nominated herself for secretary again. Rudy declined a position but offered to help with oversight. They asked if I'd be willing to write up a proposal for the new bylaws. I'm not a lawyer, I said. No, Richard replied, but you're the reason we're even standing here with a clean slate. So I wrote it. Drafted a document that required recorded votes, banned unilateral decisions, capped fine amounts, and required that all complaints be verified with photos and a second witness. We called it the Neighborhood Fairness Charter, and every resident got a copy. The new board voted it in unanimously. The formal hearing for Lorraine's charges was scheduled for the following month. I didn't plan to attend, there wasn't much more I could offer, and I was tired of courthouse hallways. But then Clara asked if I'd testify during the sentencing phase not as a victim, but as someone who had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do to a community. You don't have to, she said, but I think it would matter. So I went. The courtroom was packed. Lorraine sat between two attorneys, thinner than before, her usual smug tilt gone. When I took the stand, I stuck to the facts, the fake dues, the fire, the video, the receipts. But then I said this: she didn't just burn down a shed. She tried to burn down trust. She wanted people afraid to speak up, afraid to ask questions. But what she didn't understand is that fear doesn't grow roots. It dies in sunlight. And now that we've had some light, we're not going back. The judge sentenced her to 14 years with eligibility for parole after 9. She didn't look at me once. Outside, people shook hands and exchanged numbers. A woman from another neighborhood asked if I could help them draft their own fairness charter. I said yes. When I got home, I hung the original blueprint of my shed on the garage wall. Not because I was sentimental, but because it reminded me of something important. Structures fall, but they can be rebuilt stronger, especially when no one's standing in the way with a clipboard and a threat. 2 months after the sentencing, the neighborhood had changed in ways I never expected. Without the constant pressure of citations and veiled threats, people started talking to each other again, not just nodding while mowing lawns or waving from driveways, but real conversations. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without their parents scanning the street for clipboard patrols. The tension that had clung to this place like mildew had finally lifted, but there was still unfinished business. One morning I got a knock on the door. It was ADA Marissa Keller again, this time with a folder in hand and a look that told me this wasn't a courtesy visit. She tried to cut a deal, she said, walking past the threshold without waiting for an invitation. Her attorney offered to return a portion of the stolen funds if we dropped the arson charge. And I declined. But that's not why I'm here. She set the folder on my table and opened it to a series of scanned invoices and real estate documents. We traced several payments made through the HOA's operating account to a shell company in Arizona. It's owned by a trust that Lorraine managed under her cousin's name. Guess what that trust owns? I leaned forward. Tell me it's not another HOA. It's worse. They own liens. Hundreds of them. She was buying up debt from struggling HOAs across the state and using her board position to force foreclosures. It took me a second to process. She created debt through fake fines, and when people couldn't pay, she bought the liens and took their homes. That's exactly what she did. And we're not just talking about a few houses. We've confirmed 26 foreclosures in a 5-year span. All under the same trust. I stared at the paperwork. My stomach turned. So the shed wasn't just petty revenge. I was almost her next acquisition. Your case blew it wide open. Without that footage, we wouldn't have had probable cause to look at her financials in the first place. I closed the folder. So what now? We're filing federal charges. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and civil rights violations. She's being transferred to a federal detention center next week. And we're working with the state attorney general to open restitution claims for every family affected. Some of them didn't even know what hit them until they were out on the street. She stood to leave but paused at the door. There's one more thing. The county's creating a task force to oversee HOA conduct across the district. We're looking for residents who've dealt with abuse firsthand to help draft policy. You don't have to join, but they'd be lucky to have you. I didn't give her an answer right then. I needed time to think. I'd come to this neighborhood for peace, not to wage war on corruption. But it was hard to walk away knowing others were still dealing with the same thing, just without video evidence or neighbors willing to speak up. Later that week, I drove out to one of the properties Lorraine had seized. It was a small ranch-style home in a rural subdivision about 30 minutes away. The new owner, a man named Marcus, had bought it at auction and was in the process of restoring it. She got the place for pennies, he said, walking me through the gutted kitchen. Original owners missed a couple dues payments. HOA hiked up the penalties until it was over 20 grand. Then she foreclosed. Did they fight it? They tried, but their lawyer quit halfway through. said the board's bylaws were airtight. Not anymore, I said. Marcus leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. You're the one who caught her, right? With the fire footage. Yeah. He nodded slowly, as if trying to find the right words. I've been trying to track down the couple who lost this place. If they ever want it back, I'll sell it for what I paid. No profit. You might be the first person I've met in this whole mess who didn't want to squeeze someone dry. I know what it's like to get boxed in by people with too much power and no conscience. Feels good to do something different for once. Before I left, he handed me a printout. It was a list of other properties the trust had acquired. Every one of them had been foreclosed under questionable terms. Keller confirmed later that the restitution claims would include options to return seized properties or compensate former owners at fair market value. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer and a notebook. I wasn't a politician or a public speaker, but I knew systems. I'd worked in claims and loss for years. I understood how people gamed the rules when no one was looking, and I just seen what happened when someone with no oversight was given the keys to the kingdom. So I wrote. I outlined a proposal for a county-wide HOA oversight council. Mandatory third-party audits for any HOA collecting more than $50,000 annually. A state-managed database of board members to prevent serial offenders from hopping between neighborhoods. Protections for residents facing retaliatory fines or illegal liens with a hotline to report abuse anonymously. By morning, it was 12 pages long. I sent it to Keller. By the end of the week, it was in the hands of the county commissioner. They called it the Walters Reform Initiative. The name made me uncomfortable, but I understood the point. It wasn't about one corrupt board president. It was about making sure no one like her could ever run unchecked again. Construction on my new garage finished that month. I added a workspace with a reinforced steel door and a fire suppression system wired directly to the main line. Overkill? Maybe. But I wasn't taking chances. One evening while I was organizing tools, a familiar voice called out from the driveway. Place looks sharp. It was Richard. He handed me a box of pressure-treated lumber. Leftovers from a project. Figured you could use them. I set the box down and nodded toward the street. How's the board? Better. Still learning. But people actually show up to meetings now and no one's afraid to speak. Imagine that. He hesitated, then said they want to name the park after your grandfather. The one who built the original fence line. People still talk about how he used to fix bikes for the neighborhood kids. I smiled but shook my head. Name it after Clara. She's the one who hung on through all of it. She deserves it. I'll bring it up at the next vote. As he turned to leave, he paused. You know, this place feels like a neighborhood again. Yeah, I said. Took a fire to burn out the rot. In the weeks that followed, the Oversight Council was formally established. Lorraine's federal trial began, and the trust she used to seize properties was dissolved by court order. A fund was created using the liquidated assets, and families from multiple counties began receiving letters offering restitution. I received one too, not for restitution but recognition. The state attorney general sent a letter thanking me for exposing systemic abuse within residential governance structures. It came with a certificate and an invitation to speak at a housing reform summit. I declined the speech, but I kept the letter. One evening, I walked the perimeter of my property. The grass was a little uneven and the trash bins were still out from the morning pickup. Nobody cared. A couple of kids rode their bikes past my gate, laughing too loudly for the hour. I waved. They waved back. Inside, my calendar had a new date circled. Not a court hearing or a board meeting, just a reminder to rotate the tires on my bike. Life, as it turned out, could be simple again. And the shed? It stood solid and quiet at the back of the yard, lights on, tools in perfect order. Not a monument to what was lost, but to what was reclaimed. Not just space, but the right to live without fear.